This is the first step. This is how I create forms that I can then use as a master for the different shapes of vessel, but also vessels out of different materials. So these can be used to make moulds to then cast jesmonite, but then I also use them to create the pattern for the vessels made out of fabric. So there's my mould. Just fill it up with a bit of water.
So it's this one. And are you using something? Are you putting the molds straight in there?
I'm putting plaster straight in there, but I'm going to mix it. Mixing the plaster, just mixing a really small amount because you don't need very much, and you always put the plaster in on top of the water. Actually, I might not have mixed enough. There you go. Just make it onto the water, and then you just mix it up. Make sure you get the lumps out. And then pour it in the mould. The plaster's set. Yeah. That's the plaster. The next thing to do is to carve it. The plaster's set, but it's still damp. You can really start carving it very easily. If you waited till it was really dry, it would be very difficult to do. So I'm just using an old kitchen knife, making the shape rounded. Just basically doing quite a lot of the rough work with a knife. Just beginning to be more like a vessel shape.
And may I ask why you chose to do vessels for the ladies?
Vessels. Well, a vessel is symbolic of, can be considered to be symbolic of a female. The female form is a vessel. You know, it has a womb. We are the species that we're the people who give birth to other human beings. So we are the vessel of humanity. Whoa. And in a very abstract way, I tell you what, the vessels kind of remind me of sort of Edwardian lady silhouette, when they were very much every kind of bosoms were flattened and rounded. You know, they were just a gentle curve, and Victorian times too. And then in the 1920s, 30s, of course, you were kind of completely flattened out. So it was almost in denial that you had breasts. You can really see it's starting to shape now. And you can only do so much when it's this wet. I'll do a little bit more, just to get it a bit smoother, a bit more even. It's probably as smooth as I can get it whilst it's this damp. Okay. Now, instead of using the knife, which is quite much, you can carry on using it a bit. It's a bit rough. if I start using the scalpel, you can see the difference in
Because now it's drier.
it's a bit dry, and you can get a bit more detail, and it's just a question of going over it and getting the form. Now, if I'm just finding a form for doing the textile ones, it doesn't matter how accurate it is. And when that's really dry, what I'll just do is give it a bit of a rub with a bit of wet and dry sandpaper, and that will take out any of these little bumps that are left over. So when this one is dry and smooth, what I will do next to make it a mould so that I can make the Jesmonite vessels, ones like these, is to make a mould from it. And what I start doing is using vinyl mould, and you just melt that on your
saucepan.
In your saucepan, an old saucepan. You can see it's really old.
Well used.
And you kind of you need to make a little bit of a wall. I can use the same wall system that I use for my plaster, and you put the vessel on there. You create a wall around it, and then the vinyl mould gets liquid when it's warm, and then you can create the mould. And this is the way it would have been. And then you can see inside, that's the mould. What's really good about vinyl mould is you can cut it and hold it together. And when I cast this one, I would have put an elastic band around it. It's not particularly good. It doesn't last. It's all starting to go tacky, and it doesn't give a particularly good surface either. So when I've got a really nice Jesmonite one, you can see this one is one that's come out of a silicone rubber mould. So when I've got a really nice smooth one, then I'll make a silicone rubber mould because they last a long time. There's quite a few here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Jesmonite is a liquid again, a bit like plaster, a little bit thicker than the plaster when I was mixing it, and you can pour it in and just scoop it around until it dries. So the moulds have, with the silicone rubber, you have to make a two-part mould because it's much more solid. So I'm just trying to find two that match up. These two match up. This is number 2. So I've had to cut that in the middle, and you can see on this mould, the plaster one, where I've marked the plaster by cutting it to get it out of the silicone rubber. And then what that means when you make the Jesmonite is you end up with a little rim where your mould was separated, and you just have to clean that up. So these plaster shapes, as I said, are used for they're used for the textile fabric vessels, but they're also used as to make the moulds for the Jesmonite, and then they influence the shape of the metal ones as well. So this is the starting point for all of that. So the next step, because I want to use this for the fabric, is to work out the pattern to make, and I've got lots of ones I've made before here, and then so I break the unit up into 8. So just do it a bit roughly. Draw down the middle. Draw down the other quarter, and then find the middle of that. And what I'm then doing is measuring the widest point, just taking measurements. So that's, I'm doing that in inches. So that's 1.5 in the middle. At the top it's 8.8, and at the bottom it's 0.9. And then the length, you have to go along the curve, 6.8. What's that? So let's take a middle line. Measure 6.8. And then I've got to do just find a bit of my thing. 0.4 centimetres, 4 millimetres each side, and 4.5 shapes. And I have to cut them out. But I have to allow for little seam allowances. So if I just draw.
So this is to create the pattern for
the vessel. So
the textile vessels.
Yeah. So this, if you do it this way, you need 8. But actually, what my experience has shown me is it makes a fatter vessel than you want. So what I do is I carry on with this measurement for 8. If you then have 7, it turns out the same shape as the mould, just because of giving a bit more seam allowance than perhaps I should. So rather than cut each side, I want to make sure that they're the same. Fold it in half. And just check whether that adds. So that's actually quite. Each side is the same. So you've got to remember that that's the top. That's the bottom. There's my pattern. So the fabric I'm using is cotton organza, and the place that I got it from in London, it comes in lots of different colours, and I have dyed quite a bit of it, but this one is just navy. So this is the vessel I'm doing, which are
It's because we have seen in the exhibition that you have some vessels that they have different colours, like pink with some details and grey with indigo. So that are dyed.
They're dyed, yeah. But these ones we're going to have a different technique on.
Okay.
Because these are for Greek grandmothers.
Oh.
They're quite glitzy characters.
How exciting!
So first of all, I need to cut out 7 little fabric pieces very carefully. And because I trained as a jeweller, the scale of work is quite familiar to me, and I'm really quite comfortable with working with such small pieces of fabric. It's 2, so I folded that over to get 2. I don't fold it any more than that, just because you lose accuracy when you're cutting too many layers. So just rather do it gradually. So what I really like about these vessels is all the different levels of process that you do. So it's not just one technique, it's bringing together lots of different techniques that I've learnt over the years.
And materials.
And materials, yeah. So, you know, in this instance, the plaster is being used to create the original shape that you can work from, but I have used it in work on its own because it's an interesting moulding material.
So now that you have cut your textile pieces here, we are moving to the next stage.
And for this vessel, that stage is gilding them.
Oh, okay.
And in a very free-form way. I'm not a professional gilder. And you can gild on fabric using different media, but for this instance, I'm just using PVA. It works really well. But it has to take a little while to set again, so I'm just going to glue the areas. I've just got it on my workbench. Glue the areas where I want the gold leaf to go, which is the top, in quite a formal way. and then the bottom bit is a bit more random. Just make sure you've got enough glue, otherwise it won't stick. You kind of have to wait for it to dry a bit, but my process here is going to be slightly different. I'm just going to be a bit more random about the bottoms. So you can kind of push it.
So now that it is kind of dried,
it's a bit tacky.
It's a bit.
So
it
what
is a
I
bit
do
tacky.
is just put them on there, but because this is quite see-through fabric, if I'm not careful, it's just going to stick to the table there. So I just turn it over. It's just come off already. And put it around the other way, and then it's going to dry easier. Got to make sure I don't stick on the table. Doesn't have to be accurate. What you have to make sure is that you've stuck it down.
Okay.
Okay, so I've let the PVA dry, and now you can take the backing off of the gold leaf. As I say, it's really free form. You can just use your fingernails.
Do you need to add something on top to secure it, or it's just
no? I haven't. I mean, it's I mean, these vessels are inherently fragile anyway, so you have to look after them, and I think that's part of it. Is that fragility of just because something's fragile doesn't mean to say it's not worth looking after, and you spend a bit more time looking after it, don't you? Make sure it's safe. It's like keeping memories safe. And that, the other thing about vessels is that you can, they are vessels of memories, so you can see it in that way. Very random, these bottom bits. I like it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ready to sew. The next bit of the process is to start sewing them together. And for these, this vessel, I've chosen to use Lurex, which I don't use all the time. But it just seemed right. And one of the memories that Lucia had about her grandmother was that when she taught her to sew, she said how important it was that the back was as tidy as the front. So I've chosen a zigzag stitch, that's really neat inside. It doesn't look exactly the same as the front, but it's a really neat stitch. So that's why I've chosen the stitch, and I've chosen the gold leaf to decorate it because the grandmothers, both grandmothers seemed very glamorous. Gold is kind of always associated with Greece, so I just thought it was appropriate.
So would you like to talk to us about your grandmother?
Yes, so these vessels are very different from the one I made for my grandmother's, one of whom I didn't really know that well. She died when I was quite young. She was my father's mother, Ada. And she had a bit of a tough life. She was a domestic help, and I know she struggled in the First World War trying to feed her children while her husband was away. And they lived in the south of London, and her husband was a mechanic who didn't earn much money. The biggest influence on my life was my grandmother, who was Dorothy Alice, and her son Bernard, who lived with her all his life, didn't ever leave home, called her Alice. I don't really know why. But her husband died when I was quite young too, and she said he was always quite damaged by fighting in the First World War. But my grandmother just lived up the road while I grew up, so we could just walk up there and see her, and she would sit with us, me and my sister, and show us how to knit. She taught us how to knit, how to crochet. And she was part of the WI in the village, and they had a craft group, and they learnt new skills, new techniques every now and again. And I know she worked with leather one time. She did lots of kind of embroidery techniques, and then she learnt how to tat. Did tatting, which is using a little shuttle, a bit like crochet, but more delicate. And she taught me how to do that and make peppermint creams at Christmas. She was a very nice lady. You've sewn the 7 pieces together. It's a question of joining them up to make the vessel shape. So I've now got all the 7 pieces joined together, and this is the tricky bit, putting them all together to make the vessel shape, because you're kind of working inside. So like all the other bits, it's threading the needle, making a knot. Tie it twice. This is lurex. This is quite tricky to work with. Nice knot. So work from the bottom up as I did before, overlapping. This is the peaceful part of the process. And just sit and sew.
You're using a golden thread.
Yes, lurex. Don't know what it's made from. It's shiny though. So join all the 7 together, but it's really important for me to have a base, because if it doesn't have a base, it's not a vessel, and then it's not finished. So you have to kind of work out how big the circle is. That looks a bit big, but I'm going to cut that. Better to have it too big than too small. So I've left all the little threads on the top just free, because it's not, it kind of says about the vivacity of the characters that based it on. I think these are all quite strong women, all quite lively. So that looks about the right size. So now I've got to sew it on. Just finishing off joining the bottom, which is really tricky. The trickiest bit. Just have to be really careful. Work quite delicately. I mean, it will get a bit deformed, but you just pull it out. Ooh. Just pulling it out so that I can see what I'm doing. Last stitch.
The last stitch, I like that as an expression.
Yeah. So now it's just a question of hiding the end. So it's secure. sew it in a couple of times.